Philbrick, and as I mentioned earlier, the Philbrick family, I think the first Philbrick actually came over in 1640 or something like that. I can say that without taking any of Roger's thunder because that's not going to be the topic today. The room was full of people, and a lot of people have approached us. We talked with Roger, said, can we do something similar? And I know this is technically not a public event, but obviously, everybody was welcome to join and come here. So Roger's going to speak about the roads of Rye, the history, and I know this is a passionate topic for you. So Roger, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. And thank you for having me here today to tell what little bit I know. The roads of Rye are very twisty and turny, but there's a reason for that. Back when the settlers came here, the only thing they had were Indian trails and animal paths to follow. So they kind of, the Indians and the animals took to the easiest ground to go on, and the man just followed that way. But the roads in Rye have had many stages to which they have been created. And the first one being the paths. And I think of one of the neatest ways to experience that is to walk on any of the trails that the Conservation Commission has set up. And one that comes to my mind practically every Sunday at church, I watch a gentleman walk in and sit down. Now I know that gentleman lives on Rec Road, and I know that gentleman walks to church through the woods. And that would be the same scenario that our ancestors had to follow when they went to church. The only difference was the church, and back then you were required to attend church, but the church was in Portsmouth. And to get there, they had to travel the path which we now call Bracket Road, which took them to Pioneer Road. Pioneer Road then went to Elwyn Road, to Beverly Hill Road, up to the Portsmouth Plains where the ball field is, and then into Portsmouth by way of what is now Islington Street. So to go to church was quite an ordeal, and you were required to go. So that was one of the reasons for the separations, to create your own parish so that you didn't have to travel to Portsmouth to go to church. But as it evolved, Rye became part of Newcastle. In the very beginning, there was only Portsmouth and Hampton. So you either had to go one way or the other to get to church. It's easy to imagine that the first connection between Portsmouth and Hampton would have been along the seashore. So it's pretty safe to say that the oldest route in the state of New Hampshire is now where the present Ocean Boulevard is, because that was the communicating line between Hampton and Portsmouth, other than getting in a boat and making the trip out to sea and back in. People either landed when they came to this continent as a settler, they either landed in Hampton or they landed in Portsmouth, basically because of the harbors. There was no harbor in Rye, therefore there was either one end or the other. But I'm getting off the subject of the roads, only to see that there was a need to connect these two locations together. And little by little, it grew into what we know as roads today. Back then, these paths connected farms. Now, a farm back in those days would consist of about 300 acres. The reason for the size of that was so that they had about 100 acres for grazing their animals, another 100 acres for raising the hay, and a third 100 acres woodlot. Everybody was burning wood as a source of heat, so they needed the woodlot. Back then, you would connect these pieces of your property, and those trails eventually grew into being roads. And when they became the paths that everybody used, they were subject to gates and bars, excuse me. So if you were traveling from one place to another and you came to somebody's gate, you had the authority to open the gate and pass through, but you were responsible to close the gate behind you. Those gates served to keep the animals in their owner's property, but you were responsible as a traveler to keep them in place. Once the town or the municipalities started laying out the roads, and by the way, the first road in the town of Rye to be laid out officially is the road right here in front of us, Central Road. Central Road was laid out in 1727, 1 year after the town became a parish. The road and this, forgive me, I need to give credit where credit is due. Parsons History does a great job of recording all of this history. The challenge with Parsons History is to understand what he is talking about, because back then there were no street numbers. They only used the names of people that lived on the roads. Therefore, if you don't know the old family names for the town of Rye, it's difficult to follow what Mr. Parsons is describing when he's describing a place. But it's good reading, and it does record the history. I think I'm very fortunate because I grew up in Rye, and my family was one of those old families. So I heard my relatives talking about those names and connecting them with the places. It wasn't until 1892 that the town of Rye felt that they could do something to make it easier and more convenient at no expense, and that turned out to be naming the roads. So in 1892, at a town meeting, the town meeting voted to appoint a committee to come up with the names for the roads. And they were to meet with the selectman Wallace Goss. Turned out they appointed a Tucker, a Gaskell, and a gentleman by the name of Knox to be that committee. And a year later, they presented the list of names, and it was voted, and those are the names that we now know as the roads of Rye. Again, this one was laid out in 1727, and the next road was laid out in 1728, which was the section of Washington Road from Brackett Road to the beach. So up to that point, there were no town roads, there were only paths. And in Parsons' history, in the genealogy part, the first Perkins to come to Rye came from Hampton. He was born in 1629, and he married and moved to Rye in 1730. And in Parsons' history, it describes that there was no road from his house to the meeting house, which would have been in Rye Center. Now, Mr. Perkins, he lived on Perkins, what is now Perkins Road, near the intersection of Big Rock Road and Perkins Road. And so from his house to get to Rye Center, there were paths and trails through the woods. And Central, what was the pathway for Central Road at that time, was on that side of us as we sit here today, about 1,000 feet that way was where the pathway went to Rye Center from Rye Beach. That path comes up onto Washington Road right beside Mello's Garden. And that land in between there is very wet. So it was one of the reasons for changing the route was right through here. It got changed a second time. Right, Central Road didn't stay that way. In 1800, the electric car train came from Portsmouth to Rye. The first year they were laid out as far as the Rye Beach post office, and the next year they went on to Hampton Beach. But back to Central Road, when they were laying out the railroad to come down through, Central Road went into the woods another 400 or 500 feet, and then it made a sharp right-hand turn and came out right and joined what is now the present road right out here in front. But that was such a right-angle turn in the woods that the trolley cars wouldn't have been able to make the turn. So they bought from the Philbricks, they bought land and made the round curve as we know it today. The same type of thing had to happen at the intersection of Grove Road and Central Road. There was a large S-turn in Central Road at that corner, and they bought and straightened out the line of Central Road so that the trolley cars would be able to make a smoother turn. Back then, everybody was using horse and buggy, or they walked. Then the electric trolleys was a very new invention, but it was very convenient because it was clean, it was reliable, and fairly fast. And I believe, from what my father told me, they could get from here to downtown Portsmouth in about 15 minutes. And I know in several cases, my grandfather, who had accidents, he used that as a way to get to the hospital because it was available up until 1924. In 1924, the electric car company went bankrupt. But by then, the automobiles had taken over the main form of transportation. There was still horses and wagons, but there was a great number less. But as the roads, as the cars became more available and people were confident in using them, came the need to improve the roads because the roads were so narrow. There were only really wagon trails wide enough for a wagon. The brush was allowed to grow in on the sides. It wasn't anything like what we know the roads to be today. But they started working in the late 1800s, early 1900s to widen that out. And one of the biggest changes then was they put in Ocean Boulevard. In the late 1800s, the state of New Hampshire declared that there would be a road from Portsmouth to Hampton along the seashore. It would be unobstructed from view and allow people to enjoy it. It was supposed to be a boulevard, 2 lanes going in each direction with a 15-foot strip in the center to make it of a boulevard nature. But they started to build the road in Rye at Wallace, what is now Wallacea State Beach, is where they started the construction. And at that point, they had to blast because on the first section they built was from the north end of the beach towards Odeon's Point. And around that corner and up was a chunk of ledge, which they had to take out. And in the process of doing that, and when they finally got to reality, they realized that building a road 30, 60, 75 feet wide was going to be too expensive. So they reduced the size of the road. But the state still owns a 100-foot right-of-way across the state of New Hampshire along the seacoast. In places it's been narrowed up. I don't know how, for instance, in the area of Cable Road and Perkins Road, a large subdivision went in there and the Ocean Boulevard got narrowed down to what we know it is today. But originally it was laid out to be 100 feet wide. When they came to the area which is now the end of Sea Road and South Road, the ocean had eroded so much of the land from that time that it was planned to the time that they were constructing, that they decided that they needed to go on the west side of the beach club, where it was originally proposed to go on the east side of the beach club. So this erosion that we experienced this past winter is nothing new. It's been going on for a long time. So the roads evolved little by little. The town of Rye used to employ 80 plus men during the summer. to work on the roads and help build them as they are today. They didn't work every day because they were farmers. So as whatever season of the year, and usually the construction could only take place from April through November. They didn't have the equipment to break up frost, so they had to wait till the frost is out of the ground in the spring, and then they had to stop in the fall before the frost started entering into the ground around Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was usually considered time to have work in the ground done because you never knew when it was going to snow or the temperature was going to freeze the ground to the point you couldn't work it. The men back in 1900 that were building these roads didn't have much equipment other than pick and shovel and ox cart or dump cart with horses pulling. So they ended up building the roads to a condition that weren't satisfactory for automobiles or even for springtime travel because they didn't take the loam, the topsoil out from off the road before they put down the gravel. And even the gravel was not what we consider gravel today. And so in the springtime, when it got what we call the mud season, as the frost is coming out of the ground, the roads were almost impassable because they were just mush. They wouldn't stand any weight. So they ended up, one of the first pieces of equipment the town of Rye bought in 1919, they bought a rock crusher. And years ago, I remember Mr. Hammond telling me that as a boy, he worked for the town. And one of the things they did is they went along and they had a portable crusher and they would take rocks off of the stone walls and put them in the crusher to make crushed rock to build the roads with. Today, if you touch the stone walls, it's sacred. It's a sin, not a law, unlawful. But so they came up with newer and better methods, better equipment, and the road building techniques improved. In 1923, the road agent at that time was Mr. Rand, Sherman Rand, and he brought it to the attention at town meeting that they needed two things. They needed to accommodate the automobiles as well as the horse and buggies. The winter travel by automobile was very limited, and a lot of people jacked their cars up on blocks and didn't use them during the winter because just that, snow drifts, and if they didn't have tire chains, they weren't going anyplace because the old tires weren't designed to move in snow and on ice. They were kind of a rounded, smoother than what we see in our tires today. But they were able to accommodate automobiles and horses at the same time because they only plowed half the road. They plowed one side for the automobiles and left the other side of the road unplowed, and they packed it down so that the people that used sleighs were able to then travel by horse and sleigh. But we were very fortunate. By the time all of us experienced driving in the winter, they were by then using better equipment, and they had come up with a technique of salting and sanding the roads so that it was safer to travel in winter times. That's about all I have to say. Are there any questions?
So Roger,
Yeah.
I've read in the town reports back from the 1800s, a lot of times you'll see expenditures to a certain, person, it gives a name. So it might be a Clark down on Clark Road for maintenance of the road, or a Trefethen on Sagamore for maintenance of the road. So is that, now that's 1800s. Is that because they didn't have anybody in the 1800s, so you were I've heard that you're responsible for the so much section where you live to maintain it, and the town would give you a stipends to do that.
Back until the early 1900s, they didn't have any real organization to take care of the roads. The selectmen were responsible for the roads up until 1913. The first road agent was appointed, a gentleman by the name of H.A. White. I don't know at what location he lived or if he was even a native of the town of Rye. His name does not show up in the genealogy, so I assume he came to Rye at a later in life. To answer your question, they divided the town into sections, and they appointed men to be responsible for, and they called them divisions. There were 3 or 4 divisions, and my grandfather's brother just happened to be in charge of this division on Central Road, and he was the one that was responsible for starting the pit that is now the transfer station on Grove Road. That he made the arrangements with the lady that owned the land, and he got a 99-year lease, and that lease just ended a few years ago, and the town bought it from the surviving heirs. Yes, Alex?
Roger, I'm so glad that you mentioned parsons and figuring out where people live, because of course there were no road numbers until about 50 years ago. So Louise Tolman created the last map of Rye, the map for the last year of the 19th century, the year 1900. Every single person, every single house owner in this town is identified through this numbering system she created. It's fantastic. Look at the other 4 maps, you gotta get out the magnifying glass. This thing makes it so much easier. And of course, his history was published 5 years after this map. So they go together very well. Just something else that was mentioned earlier. If you look at the July newsletter, I wrote a piece about the 8 sources of Ryan history that are all online. And the one that was referenced earlier about all those golden records of town reports, that was the Mormons. They digitized all that stuff. They wrote it and they digitized it, printed it out. So they're the ones responsible. So you go on to familysearch.org. I can do it, you can do it. And I was able to set up an account and look up old records. So that's just number one, things online. If people ask me for Rye Harbor, just go to my website, ryehistoryrocks.com, and you will see under the topics, I have a narrative history of Rye Harbor, short version, or you can read, a book just like that. That's 20 years old. So anyway, there's just some follow-up, but this map relates to what you're talking about.
Thank you.
I have to say one other thing about Parsons. I'm with Roger. I mean, it is so good. There's one line I'm going to paraphrase. I don't have it exact. I'm going to make up the names. Mr. Rand lived in back of Mr. Berry's pasture, way down by the old oak tree. And that is in the chapter, Some People and Where They Live. So
Yes.
that's my favorite chapter.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Do you have a personal favorite road that might be off the beaten track that many people don't know about that you personally think is one of the nicest roads in the town?
Wow, that's a deep question. Yes, I would think that would fit Fern Avenue. I've always felt, and Love Lane. Love Lane, excuse me, probably Love Lane would have been the original. Before the 1954 hurricane, Love Lane was like driving in a tunnel. The road was on both sides was bordered by tall pine trees. And in 1954, when the hurricane came through, it flattened those pine trees and forever changed the nature of that road. The Brown family owned that property, and it was about a month that the Love Lane was closed before that was cut open. And they accomplished that by moving a portable sawmill onto the property. They cut the trees up and made lumber. And I can remember the field, if you turn off of Central Road and you are headed west on Love Lane, where those new houses are on the right was a hayfield. And I can remember haying in that field several times. But in 1954, after they lumbered off Love Lane, they filled that field with stacks of lumber to dry. They left them there for a year, and then my dad was given the responsibility, hired to move that lumber to be planed. And the planing mill was at the house across from the town hall. And as kids, we had to help him load lumber and unload lumber, but he would back in the driveway of that house and dump off the load of lumber, which would kind of slide into that garage. That building is a long building towards the rear, and the lumber would come out on the other end, on the back end of the building, and we'd load it back on the truck and take it back down to the Browns barn and put it inside to store it. And then 4 of the houses that were on Ocean Boulevard by the eel pond were built out of those houses, out of that lumber. That's getting off the track a little bit. But it's all connected. Yes.
Roger, can you talk about the piece of the road that's on it's an old, you said it's one of the oldest roads. So it's part of what used to be Central, right? And it's on your property, on the farm, on the family farm. Can you talk about where that was? And so the current one bypassed that? Is that what happened?
Yes. Again, you got to go back. It was 4/17/27. And probably, as Mr. Parsons said about Mr. Perkins in 1730, there wasn't a road over here. It had been laid out to be a road, but it hadn't been built. And at that time, the road was 800 to 1,000 feet that way, behind, to the west of us now. It was just a lane, but it was wide enough for an ox cart and a pair of oxen, not what you would consider a thoroughfare of any nature. But back then, they spent most of their time on the farm, and they didn't need very much road, only to go to church on Sunday, and that would have been done walking. Or the other alternative would be to get in a boat and travel by boat. But even then, there was no harbor, so they had no way to get out into the ocean from here. From Hampton, you could get out into the ocean. But other than that, it was in 1754 that one of my relatives, Joe's Philbrick, decided that there was a need for a harbor. This is in Parsons history. I'm not telling stories out of church, but it's in Parsons history, and I give Parsons history all the credit I can because there's so much information in that book. But he felt there was a need for a harbor. He was in his 50s at that time, age-wise, and he started his land was down at the end of Central Road, where Causeway Road and Central Road come to the ocean. That's where the Philbricks landed. That's where the first Philbricks put foot in Rye, was in the area around the end of Central Road. That's the Farragut Hotel was built by a Philbrick. Ebenezer Philbrick had the first rooming house down there, and places of entertainment. And it's in Parsons history that people from inland would come down to buy fish, and then they would spend the night at Mr. Philbrick's establishment, but they didn't probably sleep. But as you go along Ocean Boulevard and you go over the Rye Northampton town line, there's a pond down on the marsh. And that pond is called Philbrick's Pond. And that's where Joe's Philbrick had originally planned to establish the harbor. He started to dig a channel. If you go around the curve in that stucco house is right in front of you. There's an outfall that comes out of that pond right there, and that's where he was going to make the entrance to the harbor. He started, but decided that he needed to get help. So he petitioned the General Assembly of the state of New Hampshire to be able to hold a lottery. And that was in 1754. And he went before the General Assembly in February, and in March he died. He got the lottery was approved, but he never lived to see it happen. That was in 1754, and in 1795, the town of Riot town meeting voted to make the harbor where it is today. So again, I got off the track, but it's all connected.
Roger,
Yeah.
how long did you lose power for at Hurricane Carol before? Do you remember?
How long?
How long did you lose your electricity in 1954 Hurricane Carol? Do you remember? It was very exciting.
It was a week.
It was weeks. The school was delayed starting because right at the beginning of September, and the whole town was, we're all thrown back into pre-industrial life.
Yeah, that was quite an experience. It was the trees were still in foliage, and the wind was so strong that it took the chlorophyll out of the leaves and turned the white houses a shade of yellow. It was quite an experience. That was Hurricane Carol, and I was only 10 years old, so Alex was only 9, and but that was one of the things that I credit knowing what I do, because at 10 years old, I started going with my father. My father was hired by a lot of people to cut up the trees that fell on their property, do all kinds of different things. But I got to know a lot of the names, and I got to know a lot of the people. There was one thing I was going to say, and I forgot, but thinking about some of the people that I've known, one of them was a land surveyor. This does pertain to roads. This land surveyor, when he first got married, he owned a house on Big Rock Road. Then he bought the farmhouse on Grove Road that they're now remodeling. But this gentleman, Mr. LeSueur, John LeSueur, Sr., was a land surveyor. And he told me that the way that they measured the length of the roads was they took a wagon and they measured the circumference of the wheel on the back, the larger of the two wheels. They measured the circumference of that, and then they put a mark on the inside of the wheel and put a young man in the back of that wagon to watch how many times that mark came around. The driver would then drive down the road to a point where there was a turn, and they'd stop, and they would record the number of times that mark had occurred. And that gave him the length, by multiplying that gave him the length of that section of road. And then he would go in a straight line to the next turning point, and they would do the same thing. And at the end of the road, they'd tally it all up, and they'd know the length of the road. Okay, any more questions?
Thank you so much, Roger. Appreciate that there. I know that everyone, talk about, Washington Road. I know there's that famous story that George Washington came through town. What year was it? 1789 or something like that, right? And he had a drink over on the corner of in that house that's called Garland Tavern, right? In that
Right.
house, and actually there's a sign out. So I think that's how that road was named, right? I think, or at least
Yes.
We're guessing.
Yes.
we're guessing, yeah. But then on Lover's Lane, I thought you would dig into that a little bit deeper, but I think there's a reason why they called that, right? Lover's Lane, right? At least that's how the story goes.
That was another one of those roads that didn't have any houses on it.
Roger, do you know this story? The only reason on the trailer tour that I call it Lover's Lane is because there's a postcard in our collection, and you can see it clearly. It's written Lover's Lane. It's two beautiful elm trees. So it was done early in the century. And I always ask the trolley people, why did they change the name of the road?
People went parking there, right? One interesting thing is, I know Jen is here, but I live down on Wallace Road, and on my wife's side, her side of the family is from Boston. They came up here in the 1920s. That whole section, if you go down Wallace Road, before you hit the marsh, on the left side is the red roof, is 3 avenues, Park Ridge, Ocean View, and Appledore. That actually was, in the history of Rye, the largest development ever. There were going to be 104 units built. It's called the Manchester Colonies. Okay, that company in 1909 was going to build little cottages because the hotel era was sort of coming to an end, and people actually bought properties. And it was going to be little 5,000 square foot lots, and people from England would come out. The developer was from Manchester. A lot of people came from inland states. Were going to spend the summers here in their little cottages. Well, the guy went belly up, and then it became a tax sale. So we actually have a lot of property deeds. And Wallace Road, in those property deeds from the 1920s and 30s, it actually spelled Wallace.
Yes.
So I don't know when it changed, but I can show you property deeds, original deeds that we actually have in the basement, because that is dating back, 2-3 generations, where Wallace Road was spelled different. So I don't know if you remember when that changed or not, but it wasn't like it is always now.
There was a period when I was in grade school, so that would make it in the 50s, where it was confusing because it was spelled 2 different ways.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they settled on which one of them has to do probably with the beach, Wallace Beach.
Yeah, right. So anyway, it's kind of interesting how that happened. By the way, I don't know how many years it's been, but the town actually replaced street signs. They used to look like this. How long has it been? 10 years or something? These old street signs were given to the Rhine Historical Society. They're actually still stored at the hotel, at the society, and we will auction them off. So Lou will oversee that because Lou's in charge of collections, right? Do you know approximately when that's going to happen?
No, well, I'm presenting a proposal to the board at the next meeting, but we have 8 double signs like that one and 24 single ones that represent the different streets of the town. So we're in the process of understanding how we can do it to the best advantage of everyone, because we think there'll be a lot of it.
So, yeah.
Stay tuned.
So that's pretty cool. We do have maps around the room that actually, I think Alex held up one that showed all the names of the families. So if you want to peruse that. I do also want to point out one thing. I don't know if you remember from last year, we did have pole banners. My understanding was the first time ever in Rice history. Thank you again, Roger, by the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The first time in Rye history, I know if you've been here for a while, I think Rye can be very particular in anything approved. But we did have the pole banners approved. Actually, Deb Toohey's idea originally. We were able to push it through. We had 40 banners up. Through multiple storms, we only had 20 left. But if you're ever interested in buying a piece of our history, those banners that are up here, those blue banners, they're 5 foot tall, 2 feet wide. They are now for sale, so we were able to recover 20 of them. God knows where the other 20 are that destroyed on people's yards. They're $100 a piece, so if you want to own a piece of our history, of course, it all goes to the Right Historical Society. So if you see those, we were able to recover those. Eileen. Yes, oh, that's right. I'm glad. Yeah, that's why I put that up. One really cool event that we had last year, the Right Community Picnic. If you see the sign here, that's a reprise of last year. We are going to talk about Parsons Field. We're going to have a community picnic. I think it's Grandparents' Day, September 8th. From 12 to 2, we're going to set up a long stretch of tables on Parsons Field. I don't know if you saw that big thing in Portsmouth last year where they had the whole Congress Market Square and all that. We're going to do that here. We had it last year, unfortunately. It was really good, which is great. We have to go to the junior high. It's still a lot of fun, but not sort of the original idea. There's an Eventbrite out. That means you can register online, look for social media posting. September 8th, bring your own picnic. We're going to have stretches of tables. It's going to be fun. People hanging out, enjoying community. So it's going to be coming up. Again, anything else you want to say, Arnie? Apple pie contest, yes. So if you want to contribute your best recipe, no worries. If you want to bring your best recipe and contribute an apple pie, we had a jury of select board and fire chief, police chief last year. They determined what the best, and I think they'll do that again this year.
That's Grover.
So that's coming up
exactly.
in about a month.
College Road right here, looking up towards the dump.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The other one doesn't
No
make
music
sense.
for that, just
That's I think it's down by the Farragut. I don't
I
know.
was gonna ask, I mean, I had to imagine like it had to be, if it was really pronounced, it'd be looking from Grover down.
okay.
But yeah, the stone wall doesn't make sense.
All right, cool. So let's see that. We have this. You can hang out this drinks and water. We have some merch here for the Historic Society. That sort of concludes the official presentation part. Any other questions anybody have? Yes. Okay.